Functions are an incredibly useful tool in programming. It makes your code a lot easier to read, and it makes your code a lot more reusable. So in today's video, we're going to take a deep dive into functions. So what exactly is a function? Well, a function is a piece of code that can hold other lines of code, and then it can later be used as many times as you want. It's very similar to a variable where it holds a value, and then it can later be referenced to pull out that value. But instead of holding a single value, it's going to hold multiple lines of code, kind of like a procedure. So to write this function, we're just going to say function. And then after that, we need to give this function a name, and you can name this whatever you want. I'm just going to go ahead and name this log. And then we're going to put some double parentheses, and after that, we're going to put some double curly braces. Now, inside of here is where our function code is going to go. So let's just start off with a simple one. Just let's say console.log hello from inside of the function. Alright, and if we save that, nothing's actually going to happen because we just defined the function. We haven't actually done anything with it just yet. But to use this function, all we have to do is we need to call it. So to call a function, all you have to do is type out its name followed by opening and closing parentheses. So we could say log, just like that. And if we save that, and then we go over here to our inspector, and in our console, you can see hello from inside of the function. And this is a basic function, and this is how you can call a basic function. And as I said before, you can actually reuse this function. So we can call it 4 times if we want, and it's going to call that function 4 separate times, logging this value out 4 separate times. Now, before we go any further, we need to understand scope. But what is scope? Well, scope tells you exactly where you can and cannot access different things depending on where you define it inside of your application. So let's go ahead and let's get rid of that, and let's go ahead and create a constant called name, and we'll just set that equal to Kyland. And then let's go inside of our function, and we're going to console.log name. And if we save that, you're going to see that we first get this log here, and then we get that name value logged out. And this right here is what is considered global scope, meaning that it's not inside of any type of curly braces whatsoever. It is globally available, and it can be accessed by anyone, anywhere on this application. Now let's go ahead and change this up a little bit. We'll go ahead and move this constant inside of the function, and we'll go ahead and move this console.log outside of the function. And if we save that, you're going to see that we get an empty console log here. But why is this happening? Well, this is because of function scope. Function scope is a different type of scope that is scoped specifically to a function. And whenever you define a variable inside of a function, it is only accessible inside of that function. So you can have other functions inside of this function, and we'll get to that later. And those functions will have access to this variable. And so as long as it's defined inside of this function, it has access to that variable. But as soon as we go outside of that function, it no longer has access to that variable. And you can actually use the keyword var inside of here as well, because originally we just had function scope and global scope. But with the introduction of let and const, we now have a third type of scope, a more generic version of function scope called block scope. Now, block scope is considered anything that is surrounded by curly braces. Now, for var only works for global scope and function scope. It does not work for block scope. So something like an if statement would not be a function scope, but it would be considered a block scope. This is why we should use let or const inside of an if statement or anything really that is surrounded by curly braces, because it is scoped to just that specific block. So if we created a constant here called age, I'm very generic here, and we set that equal to a value, we cannot console.log that age value. We can't access that age value outside of that if statement. And just to be clear, I'm not saying that you should use var, I'm just saying that you can use var inside of functions because it does work with functional scope. But now that we understand scope, let's go ahead and move forward with our functions. And the next thing that we're going to do is we are going to look at arguments and parameters. Now, a parameter is a value that a function is expecting to receive. And we can define our parameters inside of these parentheses up here. So we could say that we are expecting to get a name value. So whenever we call this function here, we are expected to pass an argument as a parameter. So this parameter is a value that you expect to get whenever the function is called. So whenever we pass in an argument to the function call, let's say that we want to pass in that const name is equal to Kyland. And let's go ahead and get rid of the name inside of the function. And we can actually pass this name value into this function and it will receive it inside of here. So we can actually pass globally scoped variables into a function, or we can actually pass functionally or block scoped variables into a function as well, and this will receive it perfectly fine. And this is why we have arguments and parameters. So whenever we have a value that we need to send from one function to another, we can actually easily do that even if they don't have access to them through scope. So if we wanted to access that name value, we could just say console.log name, and that value, even though it is globally available here, we can pass it in as well. Now, an easier way to see this actually is to create another function, and we're going to set up this function to call the other function. So that way it doesn't actually have access to the variable. So let's just say call. And we're going to set up this function so that we create the constant name, and then we can call that log method inside of this call method. Now, we do need to call the call method here. So what's going to happen is we're going to define this here, and we're going to define this here, and then we're going to call this method here. Now, whenever we call this method, it's going to create this variable that is initially scoped to just this function. This variable cannot go outside of this function whatsoever. But since we are expecting a value up here inside of this function, whenever we call it, we can pass that value in. That name value can be passed into that function call, and then it will be received by this function up here, which gives it access to that value. So whenever we call the call function and then we save that, you're going to see that this works here perfectly fine, simply because we passed in the argument here that we were expecting inside of this function up here. Now let's get technical here for just a second. So I just said argument and parameter basically interchangeably. So what exactly is an argument and what exactly is a parameter? Well, a parameter is the value that a function is expecting to receive. So this right here is the parameter, and you can even see that it says parameter. Now, an argument is a value that the function is receiving, the actual value that the function is receiving. So this is what's considered an argument. Whenever you call it, you pass in the argument. The function is expecting to receive a parameter. So these are both basically the same thing. They are used interchangeably, but technically they are two separate things. Now we can actually pass in multiple separate arguments in here as well. So if we are expecting to receive a parameter called age, so we could expect to receive name and age, then we could create this constant down here called age, and then we could pass it in as an argument to this function call. And order here is actually very important because this function here has absolutely no idea what it's supposed to be receiving. All it knows is it's supposed to be getting something here and something here, and it's supposed to call this one name and this one age. So whenever we pass these values into this function call, we need to make sure that we pass them in the correct order, because all this one knows is it's supposed to be receiving two separate parameters. So let's say we can console.log age here, and if we save that, you can see we get the name console logged and then the age console logged. But if we were to swap the orders whenever we pass them in, so we could say age and then name, it's still going to work perfectly fine, but the problem is it's going to be referring to the name as the age. As you can see over here, we actually got age logged out as name, and we actually got the name logged out as age. So this function here did its job properly. It did what it was supposed to do, but we didn't pass in these values properly to this function. So whenever you are passing in arguments, you have to make sure that you're passing them in the order that it's expecting to receive them. And this brings me to another small point that may actually confuse some people. Whenever we are expecting values passed in here and here, we don't actually have to name them the exact same thing as what we named them whenever we pass them in. So as this is just an alias for the value that is passed in. This is just a variable that is holding the value that is passed in. So whenever we pass this in here, we can actually say person name, and we can actually say person age. And then whenever we pass these here in, we can say person name and then person age. And this is going to work perfectly fine because this function is not expecting to receive a specific name. All it knows is it's receiving two values. One is going to be called age and one is going to be called name. Now we can also create an optional parameter, and what this is a parameter that we optionally can or don't have to pass into the function. So if we wanted to create an optional parameter, we would have to give this a default value to fall back to if we didn't actually pass in a value. So the way that we do that is we could set this value in the parameter definition to its default value. So we could say this age, if we wanted to create an optional parameter called age here, we could say the age is equal to unknown. And then if we do pass in a value here, then it's going to use that value that we passed in as this age. But if we don't pass a value in, then it's going to use this default value that we specified on this age. And you want to make sure if you create an optional parameter that you put it at the end of the parameter list, because you want your required ones to be passed in first, because you can't actually pass in a required one after you don't pass in an optional one. So if we had these roles reversed here, where we have the optional one at the beginning and then the required one after that, and we don't want to pass in a value here, we can't just do this where we say nothing comma person name. We can't actually do something like that. So we would have to put the optional parameters at the end. That way we can pass in our required ones, and then our optional ones can or may not come. Now I want to talk a bit about another concept called hoisting. And don't worry, this is a much more advanced concept to really get into. I'm just going to brush over the basics so you kind of have a general understanding, and you really shouldn't have to utilize hoisting as long as you are writing your JavaScript applications with how the JavaScript parses the files in mind. So let's talk about this right here. So whenever we have a globally scoped variable like this, how are we accessing this variable after we are utilizing it in this function call here? Well, this is what's called hoisting. So essentially it's a concept where you're going to pull all of your variables and your function declarations to the very top of the page. That way you can create them anywhere and access them anywhere as long as they are globally scoped. And that's all I'm going to talk about hoisting today. If you want to learn more in depth about hoisting, you can go ahead and just Google JavaScript hoisting. It's not really a major concept that you have to understand. I just wanted to give you an idea of what hoisting was in case you ever ran into the term. Now let's take a look at nested functions and see how they work. So let's go ahead and remove all of this, and then we're going to create a new function called main. And then inside of this main function, I'm going to create a constant called name. And then after that, we're going to create another function. So we're going to say this function, and I'm going to call it call name. And inside of this call name function, we're going to create another constant called age, and then we're going to just console.log a string template literal with name and age. Now remember, this function here is just a regular function. It's just another part of this main function here. So it works exactly the same. We could just call name. We need to call the main function as well. And if we save that, you can see that we logged out this string template literal right here. Now, with nested functions, it has access to all of everything that's inside of it. So this function has access to this constant and this function. But what it doesn't have access to is anything that is defined inside of this nested function. But as you can see, this nested function has access to everything that's inside of this outer function. So this is called a closure, and basically what it does is it prevents outer functions, so the main function here, from accessing all of the stuff that is nested inside of this nested function. So this main function does not have access to the age value that we defined inside of this call name function. This is very specific just to this function here. But this nested function here has access to all of the function information, the constants, and everything that is inside of the outer function. And again, this nested function here also has access to the global scope. So if we created a constant here called person, and then we were able to console.log person, it still has access to that even inside of this nested function. But of course, this function out here, the outer function, does not have access to anything that is defined inside of this nested function. Now, there's actually a way that we can receive arguments from a function call without actually expecting any parameters. So let me show you how this works. So we're going to create a function, and I'm just going to name it func. And then we're not going to take in any parameters whatsoever. And then we're just going to console.log arguments. Now, this arguments is automatically given to every single function, and it holds all of the arguments that are passed into that function whenever it is called. So we could call this func function, and we could pass in as many arguments as we want, and whenever we save that, you're going to see we get an array-like object. This is actually an object that works similar to an array. So we can access each individual one of these arguments that we passed in just by using their indices. So we can access arguments index 0, and that's going to be the first argument that was passed in here. And this is a way that you can dynamically pass in arguments without having to specify what you're passing in. It's not recommended that you do it this way simply because you want to know what you're being able to access. But if you have a function that's very versatile and you have no idea what you may or may not need to pass in, this will be a good way of getting your arguments without having to set a bunch of default values or expect a bunch of different parameters when you don't have to. Now let's talk about the return statement, and this is probably one of the most powerful uses for functions. So you can actually return a value from a function call back to where it was originally called at. So let's go ahead and get rid of all of this here, and we're going to create a function, and we're going to call it next year age, and we're going to receive one parameter called cur age. And then inside of this function, we're going to create a constant called new age, and we're going to set that equal to the current age plus 1. And then we're going to return new age. Now, if we call this function, let's go ahead and console.log a string template literal with next year I will be, and let's call that function. So we'll say next year age, and we'll pass in our current age, And if we save that, we're going to see next year I will be 55. Now, what is happening here is we are calling this function right here inside of this string template literal with the current age of 54. It's being passed in as current age. Then we're creating a new constant with the current age, which is 54, plus 1, which makes new age 55. Then we're going to return this new age back to here. So whenever all said and done, it's going to return this value back to where the function was called at. And this is a very helpful piece of functions, and it allows you to do a lot of different things, and it allows you to separate a lot of different code so that one function does one thing and another function does another, and it'll just return the value back to you. Now, probably one of the most important parts about the return statement is that whenever the return statement is encountered inside of a function call, that function call is going to immediately come to a halt. That function call is going to completely stop right there at that return statement. So let's take a quick look at an example. So let's just go ahead and reuse this function here, and let's just say if current age is less than 18. So if the age that is passed in is less than 18, then we're going to return user is too young. Now let's just change this here a little bit, and let's create a string template literal, and let's just say user is going to be, and then let's just pass in the new age that we created up here. Now, if this if statement is encountered, meaning that the user is under 18, then we're going to return user is too young, and this will not run down here whatsoever. But if it does not encounter this return statement here, so if this is not true and this does not run, then we're going to return this value here. So let's just go ahead and get rid of this here, and let's just make the function call next year age, and let's just pass in the 54 again and see what happens. So if we save that, you're going to see user is going to be 55, and this never actually ran right here. But let's just pass in 5. And if we save that, we're going to see that user is too young, but we never see this being returned here. And that's just simply because we got the return statement here, and then the function call completely stopped right here. It went no further whatsoever. Now, one other use of this is just to return. We can just return nothing. And technically, it's not going to return nothing. It's just going to return undefined. So you're going to see undefined logged out into the console whenever we just return. But this is one of the most common practices, one of the most common use cases for a return statement is to just end the function call with something like this. So if we have an if statement that we want to completely stop the function as soon as that if statement is true, then we're just going to return as long as we don't have to return anything. So since the return statement can be a bit difficult to wrap your head around in the beginning, I've created a basic realistic example of how you would use the return statement in a real life scenario and how you can work with it whenever you encounter it during your coding. So if you already understand the return statement, that's great. You go ahead and skip this section if you want. Otherwise, we're just going to go ahead and go through this whole thing, and we're going to understand exactly what this does and how it actually returns the values that it does. So to start, I've gone ahead and created a function called rank sports teams. And then down here, I've got a console.log, and inside of the console.log, I've gone ahead and called that rank sports teams function. So that way, whenever we get our return value, it's going to be returned directly inside of the console.log, and it can log out those values once the function is done executing. So to start, we've got this sports teams constant with an array of objects, and each object has a team, a win, a loss, and a win percentage value. Now I've got this highest standings array, and I'm going to be using this as our return value. So I've gone ahead and just created an empty one so we can push values onto it as we need to. Next thing we're doing is we're looping over the sports teams array, and we're accessing the length to make sure that we're still within the length of the array. So as long as we haven't gone through all the teams yet, we should still be looping through this array. The next thing we're doing, we're checking to see if the sports teams at index I and their .win percentage is greater than 0.5. So if this value right here is greater than 0.5, then we're going to grab the highest standings array and we're going to push the value, the team name, onto that highest standings array. And then we're going to continue to loop through that array, that sports teams array, pushing the highest standings values as long as their win percentage is greater than 0.5 onto that highest standings array. So as we go through this loop, we're going to check each sports team. So the first one will be this one, and the win percentage is 0.625. So that is higher than 0.5. So we're going to go ahead and push that value, the name of that value, onto our highest standings array. Then we're going to loop through again, looping through this one here, checking to see if its win percentage is greater than 0.5, which it is not. So we're not going to do this. Then we're going to check the last one and check to see if its win percentage is higher than 0.5, which it is. So we're going to go ahead and push this value, this team name, onto this array as well. And whenever we're all said and done, we should be able to see on the console.log the highest standings as these two values right here. So this is the current value right before we return from our return statement. So whenever we return, we're going to take those two values and we're going to return them back to right here, and it's going to log out those two specific values in this console.log down here. And I hope that was helpful for you to understand how the return statement works. If you have any questions about it, leave them down in the comments and I'll answer any questions that you have. But now we're going to get back to the functions. Now the next thing that we're going to take a look at is a function expression. It's another way that we can write a function. So let's go ahead and get rid of all of this. And the way that we can write this function expression is const, and then we can write our function name. So we can just say our function name is func, and we can set that equal to an anonymous function, just like this. So the way this works is we're going to create a constant called func, and then we're just setting that equal to a function. And then inside of here, we can just console.log or whatever it is inside of the function. And this works exactly like a regular function. So we would just call func, and then we could call it like this, and it's going to work exactly the same as a regular function. It's just a different way of writing a function. Now there's actually one more way that we could write a function, and this is probably a more preferred way to write a function. So we're just going to remove the function keyword, and then here after the opening closing parentheses, but before the opening curly brace, we are going to put an equal sign and a greater than sign. And this is what's called an arrow function. And this works very similarly to a regular function. We can call the function and we still get the value logged out to the console just like a regular function. But there's a very small subset of things that make this a little bit different than a regular function. First of all, it does not change the keyword this, and I know I have not gone over the keyword this, but it does not change the invocation context of the keyword this. Secondly, it doesn't have its own arguments expression. So remember when we said arguments, it doesn't have its own arguments expression. You have to pass in every single argument into an arrow function. So if we console.log arguments, and we save that, we're not actually going to get anything logged out of the console because arrow functions do not have their own arguments. And that's really it when it comes to the differences between regular functions and arrow functions. These work very similarly, but they're not an exact copy. Now, there's one more thing that I want to take a look at, and this is called an implicit return. And what it does is the only sole purpose of it is to return something. That's it. It cannot do anything else other than just return something. And that may sound a little odd, but let me give you an example of it. First of all, an implicit return can only be used inside of an arrow function. It cannot be used inside of a regular function. So we're just going to say const add, and we're going to call this function add. And we're just going to say this is equal to, and then we're going to create two numbers that we're going to take in. So we're going to take in num1 and we're going to take in num2. And then we're going to create our arrow, and then we're just going to say num1 plus num2. And that's it. This is going to return a value based on this right here. And let me show you. Let's just go ahead and console.log add, and we're going to pass in a value for num1, which we could say is 5, and then we can pass in a 10 for num2. Now, whenever we call this, it's going to pass in num1, which is 5, and num2, which is 10, and then it's just going to add these, and it's going to implicitly return it, meaning that I'm expecting it, the way that I'm writing it, I'm expecting it to return just the value of that operation. And that is about it for JavaScript functions. Now, I know this video was packed very full with all kinds of information, so if you didn't understand anything, I encourage you to go back and rewatch the video a couple of times, maybe to help you understand. And if you still don't understand, drop a comment down in the comment section down below. I'll answer any questions that you have. Otherwise, if you did like the video, make sure you slap a like on it. Check out the full playlist, link is right next to me. Make sure you subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.